Elena Passarello is an actor and an essayist. She studied nonfiction at the University of Pittsburgh and the University of Iowa. Her works have been published in many journals, including Oxford American, Slate, Creative Nonfiction, and the Iowa Review. She is the winner of the 2015 Whiting Award and the author of 2 collections of essays. Her first collection, Let Me Clear My Throat, came out in 2012 and won the gold medal for nonfiction at the 2013 Independent Publisher Awards and was a finalist for the Oregon Book Award. Her most recent collection, Animals Strike Curious Poses, was published this year. It is a bestiary of remarkable animals and the humans who knew them. In this collection, Passarello tells the stories of animals as various as Yucca the woolly mammoth and Arabella the arachnid. As a collection, each piece works together to reveal what she calls the animal images buried inside us. Passarello excels at balancing meticulous research and artistry to create well-crafted essays. Stylistically, Passarello is dexterous. Her pieces vary widely, each with its own unique voice and form, but the common denominator among all her work is that it is masterfully put together, making her a joy to read. It is an honor to have her here with us. Please welcome Elena Passarello.
Hi, how's it going? Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you so much for having me back at BYU. I was here 3 years ago. I think definitely the second week in November. It just sort of shook down that way that both of the times I've been here at BYU, it's almost to the day. I was looking at that Facebook on this day thing this week, and I was like, oh, whoa, déjà vu. So I will expect to see you all in the second week of November in 2020, right? We'll all be just a little grayer, maybe a little chubbier, and hopefully a little happier. It's always a thrill to come back, though. I had such a great trip the last time I was here meeting students. We had a really incredible Q&A, maybe one of the better Q&As that I've ever had, no pressure. The last time I was here, and then heading up to the reception. This is definitely a hotbed of great thought and activity in terms of one of my favorite things on the planet, the essay. The last time I was here, I don't think I even had really met you. Maybe I met you once, Pat Madden and I, but now I feel like we are old friends because we worked together on the Nonfiction Now conference, which is also how I've met so many incredible BYU students for over the years. So I'm just chuffed to bits to be back. And I really appreciate you all being here. I look forward to meeting you at the reception as well. So I thought maybe I would read a little bit from the beginning of the book and a little bit toward the end of the book, because it's a chronologically arranged book. The book is a collection of essays on animals in history. It is modeled after a medieval bestiary, or a bestiary, as the medieval studies person at my university corrected me years ago when I went up to her and said bestiary. But where in the medieval books, one of the things that really sort of drew me to using this form is that these medieval bestiaries were this wonderful mix of fact and imagination. So there would be entries in bestiaries about animals that were very common to the areas where usually monks were writing these books of beasts. Essays or little entries about cats or dogs or beavers. And then right next to them would be an essay about a giraffe, which they'd only heard through hearsay from Spice Road travelers who would come back with these tales about a giraffe. And the drawing of the giraffe would be kind of wrong, like kind of would look like a Dalmatian with like salamander ears. Or right next to an essay or an entry about a cat, there would be an entry about a unicorn, right? And I loved that you could have a book of facts that was also a book of imagination. So that's kind of what drew me to start writing not just an animal book, but an animal bestiary. And pretty early on, I realized I wanted it to be a bestiary of animal celebrity. I wanted all of the animals in the book to have been named in some way by a human that had recorded it in our historical record in one way or another. And shortly into it, maybe 50% of the way through, so halfway through, I realized that I wanted it to be a chronological book. So a book that began with the oldest animal and ended with the youngest, rather than grouping them by species or type of story. So the book begins with an essay on Yucca, this woolly mammoth who was found sort of in the Siberian permafrost. She sort of fell out of it a few years ago, and they found this gash on her back There was a serrated gash, so they think that it was probably the work of early humans. So that's the first mark in the historical record. She's 39,000 years old, and it goes all the way through history to stories of Renaissance animals, circus elephants, animals that have been shot into space, animals that were used to make a lot of the scientific discoveries that we still think of today. Mozart's favorite bird is in there. And it ends with Cecil, the lion, who was shot by a Minnesota dentist in 2015. There's also essays about de-extincting animals, this process that we're talking about now of taking extinct animals' genetic material and finding ways through hybrid forms to bring the species back to life. I'm so happy to talk about all of these things in the Q&A, all of these animal issues, if you'd like to. But so from the beginning of the book, I thought I would read the very first essay that I wrote for the book. It was the essay that gave me the idea to write the book, because I learned about this named creature, and the fact that he had this name just sort of fascinated me to no end. So Shakespeare had a lot of rivals, right? Like it wasn't just Shakespeare's game when he was writing plays. If you've seen the movie Shakespeare in Love, there's a little bit that sort of talks about his competitive nature. He often sort of kind of crankily, kind of moodily name checks these rivals in his plays, or not name checks them, he just alludes to them. So there's an allusion to Christopher Marlowe in As You Like It, and there's a kind of cruddy reference to the Children's Company that had a theater that took a lot of tickets from him in Hamlet. But the only rival that he actually says the name of in any of his plays is a bear. And this is a bear named Sackerson, who in 1600, the Globe Theater on the banks of the Thames, you guys have seen pictures of the Globe, or maybe some of you have been to the Globe, right? There was an identically structured building right next to it that was called the Bear Garden. And that was where animals would fight each other and people would watch and place bets on them. And no animal was ever more championed. He was like the New England Patriots of I hate the Pats, but he was like the Steelers of the Elizabethan bear baiting world, and this bear, Sackerson. And so many people chose to go see Sackerson fight than to go see Hamlet that Shakespeare ended up angrily referencing him in The Merry Wives of Windsor. And when I learned that, and when I learned that probably every day of my life, somebody on some stage somewhere was going to say the name of this sort of marginalized bear, the whole book kind of popped into my head, right? What a kind of infamy to have. So this one's about a 7-minute read. Every essay in the book, the title is the name of the animal, and this one is called Sackerson. The London garden, brackish and packed in, was hazy with a dozen kinds of flesh. The bulls, cocks, mastiffs, men, and chimpanzees in air so rickety it lowered the roof. So dark, the line tween crowd and beasts was marred. And there, in that black, Sir Raleigh took his Frenchmen, and other men of duty met their spies. The reason for their famous fireworks, just so the folks who'd wagered bets could see. A rose of flames pitched high above the crowd fired smoke into the muck that hung about. It spun. It spat red bits around the seats, and they'd rig it to toss pears as it rotated. The fruit-mad crowd would then jump up and chase the rolling pears out to the bankside streets. Or yard boys, eager in their dirty gloves, would toss hot bread upon the patrons' laps, which made them clutch and scurry toward the exits. Outside, they'd find some other Sunday sport. An archery butt, a woman, or a play. The stews downriver had less fornication, and St. Bartholomew's floors less wet with blood. The bloody muzzle, or the mastiff's blood, the blood of fisticuffs up in the stands. The blood of offal floated down the Thames to Bankside from the abattoirs of town. And by the time the century turned around, it seemed the blood most often spilled was his. But do not think that London's garden crowd imagined him some broken, bashed-in thing. Believe me, this is tricky. I might see the lives of baited bears as nothing but a broken cord of muzzle, chain, and stake, of blunted teeth, barrages of dog jaws, of living out a mongrel just to have another thrown upon the slavered flesh. That rink's the only place that he could run. A hard one, constitutional, running laps and dodging bulls in that dank polygon, that garden, broken even in its flowers. The rosettes they affixed to his brow were bullseyes for the mastiffs when they jumped. And jump they did, mouths tearing at the flesh that leered at them from each side of the bloom. They bit so hard that London citizens grew up thinking a bear's eyes to be pink. A few years of that, he was too blind to fight. The bear ward had to get creative then. Chained center, hunkered, lashed by volunteers until the blood ran rivers down his spine. Sometimes he'd raise his matted arms and gnash about the lash until it broke in half. And once, he stooped low to the lazy knot, untied himself with effort from the stake, then nosed about the rink in backward loops to hear the ladies scream, the bearward scramble. They dragged him off stage 2, his pit, in cheers. For even them, near lame and sightless, he could still throw 9 stone mastiffs to the crowd, up to the boxes, to the ladies' laps, bypassing pumpkin hose, straight to the skirts. Like he could sniff a woman's quivering thigh and hurl the big dog head or tail right to her. A snort, a twitch to shudder the dog spit, a fling, a lady's lap, a going, "Ooh!" And then they'd add another dog, then 3, till 6 or 7 mastiffs lined the rink, the sound more deafening since his sight was gone. Confounded if he wasn't still around. They could have put his picture on the money. Elizabeth, who never said hello, loved him enough to ban old Thursday sport. Upon the mildest Thursdays, he'd parade out past the playhouse, down to London Bridge. He'd smell the ragmen, actors, punks, and stews who yelled for him in ripe cacophony, and the bulls in ribboned horns all marched behind, and the cocks in boxes and the dogs behind, the only bear that ever led the dogs. Upon the mildest Thursdays, he'd parade out past the playhouse. Oh, did I already say that? Yep. No, that's right. This is the first time this has ever happened. Never say that you've memorized. It's because I took the swear words out. And I realized when I was reading this, like about halfway through, I was like, oh no, there's a bad swear word in this. I'm in school. And then I was trying to think of, because this essay's an iambic pentameter, I was trying to think of a swear word that would match while I was reading it out loud, and I was trying to think of it that would scan in iambs, and my brain is just not smart enough for that. Okay. And even on his nights off, he appeared in name checks at the Hope, the Rose, the Globe, a dactyl in the mouths of water poets, the only rival Shakespeare called by name, in Johnson, in Act 5 at Dunsinane, at Middle Temple Hall on Candlemas, when Chambers' fairest boy in fake dugs crooned, "Have you not set mine honor at the stake and baited it, with all the unmuzzled thoughts that tyrannous heart can think?" So it'd be wrong to match that bear with breaking. They built him up. They called him out by name because they read in him a secret code both terrifying and recognizable. They read it in his stance, up on 2 legs, the 4 paws spread, the 10 claws digital. They read it in his low-slung hips and gut, the way his pupils, round and beady, lived inside a circle of expressive white. And milliseconds prior to the bite, they saw it when he bowed his head and sighed. What did they see? They saw themselves, of course. A taller man, more leaden and hirsute, with thick skin better suited for a beating, but still, their bear, this massive chestnut frame dwarfed tiny by a darkened ring of foes. The smaller ratio of the rink itself dwarfed by the river, flowing to their north, that lurid, pestilent Thames. 6 city plagues, the pox, the new ague, the curious sweats, all floated past their bear garden in leagues. A river of unprecedented sick. In 92, things got so royally poxed, the playhouses were forced to shutter up. A quarter of their population down each decade, give or take 100 score. And a blighted age can make a garden blind. Each ticket holder turns left, right, behind, then wonders which part of their dark quartet will suffer an unnatural upset next. For when our clans explode up into towns, the backbite comes from nature, and it smarts. The devil holds back nature by its ears, takes aim, makes wager, then releases it. And we toss it off, and it regenerates. 6 natural mouths leap forth before we're primed. Parades of sickness cannot be explained by any learned clansman, physics, priests. The inexplicable can send us toward an unclanned occupation with the self. And selves, like famous bears, are singular. We are soon switches places with I am, and then clans, bewitched by I ams, become crowds, which are an altogether different thing. He heard those I ams in the garden's roar. I am this bear stuck in this blighted rink beset upon by nature's ticking clock. I am not hunkered down in numbered packs. Instead, I am awaiting death alone. I am afraid of time's encroaching power. For each new year, I am more bluntly struck. I feel pain, feel it doubling, then I am it. I am always in weight of time's new teeth. And though befuddled, drunk on sick, I am unfit to tear mine eyes away from him. The growl of him, his mighty swipe, his blood, the way he foams both in and out of hours. My chain of foes would weigh less, I am sure, if I could shake off minutes, break pain's spine, or send plague squealing to a woman's lap. For even if I knew more time, more sick was at the go, it'd be a righteous salve to fight whatever hour's on me now. To discard the sick dog of what is now and shake it, a contaminated rag stained with the gusto of my intellect. Yes, I am jealous of his natural acts, and so I'll hit his nature with a stick. And that chipper little essay is Sackerson. Okay, so Dr. Pat Madden and I were in Phoenix yesterday planning a nonfiction conference, and he happened to mention like the worst reading he had ever seen. And he was telling the story of this person who read kind of like this the whole time, sort of read everything like this, and then when the thing was over, would look up. And so then I wanted to read the memorizing one because it'd be like, haha, never looking down, Madden, never looking down. But then I forgot about the swear words, and then everything just went to poop. So here's an essay that I haven't memorized. Although it's really, when you memorize an essay, you know, it's really interesting because usually they darken, like when you read in a theater, they darken, but usually in a school auditorium, they don't. So I can really see who has a screen. Yeah, you know who you are. I see you guys. I just saw somebody's eyes for the first time. I'm going to memorize all my essays. Because when you're reading from the page, you're like, man, they're hanging on my every word. But when you have it memorized and you look up, you're like, whoa, something is good on Pinterest today. Okay, I'm just kidding. So this is a much later essay, 1973. The first North American female in space was a spider. Her name was Arabella, and she spun a web on our first space station, which was called Skylab, in the summer of 1973, and she kind of became a celebrity. Walter Cronkite was particularly taken with her. And so if you go back, you know, in your library's news archives to that summer, you'll just find all of these really interesting articles about the whole nation sort of looking upward and wondering if this spider that's up on Skylab is going to be able to spin a web in microgravity. So I went back through all of those articles and all of the flight journals from the NASA it's called the Skylab 3 flight. So I looked through all the flight manuals, all the transmissions between them, the biographies of the 3 astronauts that are up there with her. And also spent a lot of time trying to figure out how a spider actually spins a web. It's a lot more interesting than I thought. And I wrote this essay. And it's an example of something that I was really surprised about when I was putting the book together. Well, maybe we'll talk about that in the Q&A. If nobody has any questions, say, what really surprised you about that book? And then I'll tell you the story right there. Okay, so this is probably about a 15-minute read, maybe a little more. And it's called Arabella. In early summer, once she has broken from her cocoon and spent a day or so in the huddle of her family, an adolescent cross spider feels ready to fly. She scuttles to some swatch of vegetation that faces outward, a leaf ridge, a twig, and she perches there. And then she lifts a significant fraction of her legs and pulls a silk strand from the spinnerets at the base of her abdomen. Ounce for ounce, that silk is 5 times the strength of a reinforced steel and at least twice as strong as a human femur. And when a June wind blows the silk strand into its current, she follows it with her body, a tiny balloon chasing its string. It is a journey that begins with a considerable jerk and ends only when her silk tether collides with a rooted object, a bush, a fence post. This could be a 1-yard trip, or it could send her half a mile away. A half-mile journey to a cross spider is like a man catching a wind from Milwaukee to Madison. Gravity left the bodies of the Skylab 3 crew without much warning. They had spent the early minutes of the launch pressed down into their command module's couch while 7.7 million pounds of rocket thrust pushed away the Earth. Now, a small space separated their thighs from the seat fabric. If not from the straps of their harnesses, the three men would have risen like milkweed to the low ceilings of the transport pod. It would be several more hours before a dot appeared in the navigational telescope, unmistakably white against the black of space. More hours still, waiting and hovering until the dot became a shining oblong cylinder, topped with a windmill-shaped telescope. Skylab. Here was where they would dock themselves, at the gate of this white and black and brilliant gold capsule, which was falling in the orbit of the planet they just escaped at nearly 1/2 mile per second. Not too long after landing, a cross spider spins her first full web. She casts a line outward, waits to feel it catch, and then secures the other end of the line to the spot where she rests. This creates a single strand bridge that she can walk across, which she does, reinforcing it with a second bridge line. Once suspended from the center of that bridge, she free falls, still pumping silk to form a Y shape. She then pulls strand after strand from her body, spinning and falling, climbing and plummeting, hooking each strand to the crotch of that Y. Soon, a dozen spokes branch from the Y hub like a silken sunburst. Without stopping, she turns sideways and circles the spokes, connecting them in 30 cartwheeled spirals. Here is where she switches the gears of her body to produce a stickier silk, viscid enough to trap heavy prey. With this silk, she weaves a second spiral, and after that's done, she eats the first spiral. Then she eats the hub and finally arranges herself in the hub's place. And though she will never rate a vantage to see her handiwork, and even if she could, her eyes wouldn't focus at such a distance, the young spider has just filled her space with one of our Earth's most spectacular pieces of craftsmanship, just as versions of herself have done for hundreds of millions of years. It takes her about half an hour. NASA spent almost a decade designing Skylab's orbital workshop, and its final blueprint held limited consideration for up and down. Rather than separate the station's two levels with a solid floor, a cross-hatching of beams split the workshop like an open metallic net. A long blue pole ran through the center of the workshop, so the men could pull themselves along its 48 feet, but the astronauts scrapped the pole shortly after getting their space bearings. They preferred pushing off the walls and steering with their arms, floating through that empty center to travel from the workshop's four-level, side of the dinner table, latrine, and the 3 booths in which they slept bolted to the walls, to the aft level, with its radio and TV equipment, its biophysics lab, its materials processors, and its plastic vial the size of a human thumb containing a young cross spider named Arabella. A spider was built to strum her web like a guitar. She was built to pluck a radial with one striped tarsal claw and feel how the pull of the world changes the vibration of her web. She was built to spin more sticky strands at web bottom than at web top, as gravity makes jumping down to prey less taxing than climbing up to it. She was built to drop a gossamer line and free fall from danger, to walk the strands of her handiwork upside down, using her weight for propulsion. For nothing says spider more than this built-in vigilance, this innate knowledge of what pushes her to the earth and what lifts her away from it. Her legs, claws, mouth, the silk she unspools from inside herself, they all understand, with the hair trigger sensitivity that comes from eons of experimentation, the facts of our massive planet trying to collide with her body. It wasn't until the 8th day of the mission that science pilot Owen Garriott floated over to Arabella's little vial. NASA had custom built her a 15-inch square cage, as narrow as a framed portrait, with a flat glass front. Around the frame were mounts for long fluorescent bulbs and cameras, and at the top right corner was an attachment point for Arabella's transport vial, which would create a narrow tunnel for her to pass into the cage. Nobody wanted to risk releasing a tiny spider into the free space of the orbital workshop, which the crew knew had a mind of its own. So they affixed her to the tunnel, and she refused to take it for a full mission day. Though she was only the responsibility of the science pilot, the 2 other crewmen couldn't help but keep tabs on her. Pilot Jack Lausma watched Garriott opening Arabella's little vial and floated over to assist. "It didn't know where it was, poor spider," he later remembered. Commander Alan Bean, one of the dozen men who have walked on the moon, noted her in his private journal. Owen got the vial off the cage, opened the door, and shook her out, where she immediately bounced back and forth, front to back 4 or 5 times, and then locked onto the screen panels at the box edge. There she sits, clutching the screen. The 16mm film of Arabella's earliest work on Skylab depicts not so much a spider as a specter of one, a black and gray arachnoghost. 8 thin strands glimmer about her body. These are her legs, and white dots sparkle from a dozen other faint pinstripes. These are her gossamer. In the film, she tries to free fall and hang an early radial with tumultuous results. You see her scurry along a horizontal line, half holding on and half bouncing until she loses all footing and the weightlessness floats her above the line. And a flailing of legs sends her tumbling in the other direction, sinking lower, though there is no lower to a spider somersaulting in a cage in space. She first flips head over abdomen and then corkscrews so that her rolling turns sideways. And her legs reach outward in 8 directions, and then they all move inward, clutching the empty space as one desperate claw. Eventually, she finds the hard purchase of the cage's corner, and she tries to locate some stillness there. Science pilot Garriott had spent months rehearsing his upcoming spacewalks on a drowned Skylab mock-up in Huntsville. On mission day 9, he shut the airlock room off to the rest of the station, opened the execution hatch, and exited to a place only 25 men had gone before him, out into the thermosphere, the hard vacuum, the emptiness between the Earth and its closest celestial neighbor. A 60-foot cord spooled out from his abdomen. Slowed by the fat fingers of his space gloves, he was surprised by the effort it took to pull a 5-foot pole of thin steel from the hatch, and then another, linking 11 of them end to end until they made 2 55-foot-long booms pointing out into space. He then unhitched himself from his footholds to float a giant sail of thermally treated gold fabric to the attachment points at the pole's ends. Next, he reeled the sail until it covered the orbital workshop like a golden duvet, shielding Skylab from the heat of the sun. Before returning indoors, Garriott swam to the end of the windmill telescope on the other side of the spacecraft. Since Huntsville, he'd vowed to find a moment in space to put his toes on the edge of Skylab and to look down. And what he saw was, in a sense, a distance equal to the entire length of the Grand Canyon. In another sense, he saw the equivalent of a cross spider staring over a small asteroid, perhaps the size of the one named after the schoolteacher who died on her way to space. And in a completely different sense, the science pilot saw nothing at all. Once back inside Skylab, Garriott discovered Arabella had spun her first web in microgravity. The distance between a man and the moon is a spider hiking the Oregon Trail. The distance from a spider to the end of her 16-inch silk tether is a man drifting on a 60-foot umbilical. A man tumbling from end to end of a space station is a spider free-falling down a 4-foot web. For a spider is a particle and a man is a particle, and the spider attracts the man with a force directly proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of their distances. For a man is least distant from a spider when the world he knows is multiplied by cosmic exponents. For a spider is most distant from a man when she no longer has the tools to refer to herself. The first web she made was loose and haphazard, a funhouse mirror of her gridded, earth-spun work. Since she could not feel the weight of her body on the strands, the silk she spun was of varied and impractical thickness. Few of the lines were taut or straight. The web looked like the worn-out shawl of a sideshow palmist or a sea net from which any fish could manage escape. It's the kind of web spun on Earth only when a spider has just molted or is quite near her death. It is not unlike a web spun by an amputee spider, or a spider that a Swiss pharmacologist spiked with D-amphetamine in 1948. Space was a kind of stimulant for the Skylab crew, who, in the second week of their 9-week flight, radioed mission control for extra work. Science pilot Garriott had logged 22 hours in a single mission day. Though NASA had proposed sending them to space with a game console and a movie projector, all the crew really wanted to do for R&R was stare out the window and monkey around in microgravity, because space awakens things in the human body. The men had become more dexterous and less nauseated. Zero-G had decompressed their vertebrae, each man stretched at least an inch by splashdown. In the evenings, the men floated to the ring of hulking white lockers that encircled one end of the workshop, and they ran laps, running the wheel from wall to ceiling and back down like 3 Fred Astaire hamsters. Or they would tumble and flip in their white socks and boxers, gliding into one another, making water ballerina shapes. They challenged each other to contests of floating, from the trash airlock, down past Arabella's TV cage, past the kitchen and through the hatches, all the way to the command module that brought them to space without flapping an appendage. "We might have had a shot at the Olympics," Garriott later quipped. The science pilot called this feat playing Spider-Man. The lights came on in Arabella's cage, simulating sunrise. It was 6 days after her release from the vial and 2 weeks after launch, and her air was still charged with that defeating kind of nothing that kept her lines from catching and confounded her body when she tried to repel. But the walls of the cage were solid in a way she could understand, so she connected a taut bridge line in the short gap between them. The only way to make a web in flight, she discovered, was to avoid flight, to stay grounded. Clinging to the walls and corners of the cage, she made more short silk lines, pulled them as tightly as she could, and walked along them rather than free-falling to affix every radial, every spiral turn. She used the length of her hind legs to measure each spiral. Each ring matched the distance between her spinneret and the tip of her back claw. The central claws of her third pair of legs clung to the silk like grappling hooks. And it was a less ambitious web in certain aspects. She had ringed it in fewer spirals and omitted the crucial lopsidedness of lining the web bottom with stickier trapping silk, but the structure was even and tight. Back home, a human face crashing through it could have thought it the work of any earthbound arachnid. From Commander Bean's journal, August 7th. Arabella finished her web perfectly. When Owen told Jack at breakfast, Jack said, "Well, that's good. I like to see a spider do something at least once in a while." Commander Bean again on August 8th. Arabella ate her web last night and then spun another perfect one. Commander Bean on August 10th. Owen did the spider TV 3 times today. The men and their cargo were orbiting the Earth every other hour, curving 50 degrees north and south of the equator, ringing the parallels, rising and sinking. Their remaining tethers to the Earth were the kind that are difficult to pull on. Teleprinter dispatches, the transmitted sinusoid waves of their wives' voices, the electric grid of Enid, Oklahoma, which blinked for Owen Garriott when his hometown knew he was passing overhead. And though their distance never increased from the day they docked, the human cargo drifted further with each spacewalk, each tube of liquid spaghetti, each wrench slipping from their fingers that they no longer reflexively reached out to touch. August 11th was supposedly the crew's day off, but none of the 3 wanted rest, and neither did Arabella, who spun another lovely web, her 4th in as many days. Garriott had taken to calling her our friend Arabella, and noted the day before that she was near a very large horizon at this point. In his transmission back to Earth on August 12th, he described his friend moving her web from the corners of her cage to front and center, a much more telegenic place, where it stretched ever closer to the webs of home. There was a delighted lilt in his voice when he reported how, without the benefit of previous experience and simply working on her own, she figured out a very nice solution to the problems of zero gravity. Houston woke the men every morning with news updates, but the crew knew the worst events of the day were always missing. NASA had arranged for Skylab to hear of no plane crash at Logan Airport, no coup in Chile, no serial killer found 15 miles from the very control room that shot their news into the sky. And back on Earth, Skylab was, of course, making its own headlines, at least an article a day on the men and their work hounding comets and setting records for nights slept in orbit. And most of these stories found a way to weave into their paragraphs the news of the little spider in the TV-ready box. Footage of her spinning aired on the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. Her image, perched at the center of an impressive silver-tone web, ran in Science News, the LA Times, and along the AP Wire. With each web spun, observed, photographed, and transmitted, things became stickier between Arabella, the astronauts, and the people of Earth. NASA had planned to let her die in space after a few days, but as the Washington Post reported, Arabella had earned the affection of the crew so completely that midway through the flight, Owen Garriott asked what could be done to prolong the relationship. For who could possibly condemn to death the weaver of the universe's first space web that we know of? I mean, maybe somewhere on, like Mars or something. Who could possibly condemn to death the weaver of the universe's first space web? A creature that journalist Lee Edson called probably the most distinguished spider in the world. And how could anyone be surprised when Edson announced NASA made another high-level decision? Arabella will be permitted to return to Earth with the astronauts on September 25th. By then, Mission Control had its own mascot spider, Arachne, living in a glass cage in the command center. They'd look at her when they heard Garriott in space describing his own friend, Arabella. And they radioed an order for Garriott to set aside a housefly-sized morsel of that evening's space dinner, liquid filet mignon. When Arabella is in her cage, carefully place a piece near her legs, ordered Cap Commander Richard Truly. According to the New York Times, the spider loved it and proceeded to build another web. Each new web held the planet tighter in her grip. Only Arabella could bridge the distance between all earthbound creatures and the incomprehensible developments of Skylab. the X-ray maps of the galaxy, the technicolor evidence of holes in the sun. As she steadied her slow steps along the straight line of her web and gripped the solid products of her own body for support, she was walking back to what people of Earth could understand, an organic narrative of success amid what on TV and in the papers must have seemed a dark and unnatural nebula. And she did so naked, assisted by nothing but the tangible. Her legs, her cage, the light bulb someone turned on for her every 18 hours. Dogged and stealthy, the spider created an earthly object in that wild and distant nothing. And alongside all the work of the floating men, her work was weighty and familiar. It was a lifeline tailor-made for the people of Earth. For a spider in the center of her web is less distant from you than a man backflipping through a spaceship in his underwear. For a man in space is a decorated Navy pilot in alien coveralls unraveling a golden fleece to save his billion-dollar ship from frying in the nearby sun. But a spider in space still only knows a garden sun. She lifts the same 8 unsheathed legs that tread any apple branch. She isn't an honorary doctor of science or a fellow at the American Astronomical Society. She's never seen the Earth while standing on its moon. For a spider in space has no title, just the sweet name of one of our daughters. And when we speak it, the name makes the sound of a bell in the air. Commander Alan Bean retired a few years after Splashdown to start a painting career, and nearly every canvas he finishes is a scene in oil of a man on the moon. After commanding a space shuttle voyage in the early 1980s, pilot Jack Lousma ran for state senator and lost. Owen Garriott returned to space a decade after Skylab and then helped send his son to the International Space Station 25 years later. He's the first American to pass space travel down a generation. Arabella made it back to Earth, but only just barely. According to NASA, they found the spider curled into a ball in her transport vial the day after splashdown. An autopsy will be performed, reassured Reuters. It ruled dehydration as the cause of her death, and then there was nothing else to do but catalog her with the rest of the Skylab data. Preserved in formalin and arranged in a black cylinder with a plexiglass viewing front, she's now item A19740484001 in the National Air and Space Museum, sometimes on display with Skylab's other equipment. Among the titanium alloy, the neoprene, the epoxy resin ablative, and the resin-impregnated fiberglass honeycomb, she is the rare logged item on display listed as organic matter. And though he's outlived her by over 40 years, Owen Garriott has not forgotten his spider. In 2013, he sat on a NASA panel held for the 40th anniversary of Skylab, a panel that also included a science pilot from the contemporary space station. And when this younger scientist referenced early work with animals in microgravity, Garriott, now a vigorous 82 years old, all but interrupted him. He sat forward in his chair, pushed his words out faster than he could pronounce them. His blue eyes widened as he looked into the small crowd of reporters and students and said, "Does the name Arabella ring a bell with any of you?" And behind him was a large projection of the official Skylab 3 embroidered mission patch, which had been sewn to the shoulders of all Skylab personnel. The circular patch is a take on Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man in his notorious power stance. Behind the naked man is a circle half filled with the globe and half filled with a flaming sun, and the man seems to float in the center of the patch, splitting the blue and the orange. He reaches to the edges of the frame with all 8 of his appendages. And that's Arabella. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Nice. Okay. 12:40 on the nose. Whew. So, maybe we could have a conversation about some stuff. We could talk about animals. We could talk about writing. We could talk about what you're working on right now. You could tell me where I should go to lunch. Yeah. Yeah, hi.
I have a question about, so your first book was about like singing and people who, famous people and songs, and then you moved to talk about or wrote about all these animals.
Mm-hmm.
How do you change focus?
Yeah. So.
And do you find it hard to change your focus?
So the question is about kind of focus and changing focus, because my first book wasn't about animals. It was about the human voice in performance. So singing and screaming and ventriloquism and stuff like that. And now here I am in the animal world. That was actually the joke when I stopped writing the voice book, was that my next book was going to be about mimes, because I was so sick of talking about or reading about speaking and singing and screaming and shouting that I wanted to get as far away from there as possible. And animals, in some, I guess I sort of figured that maybe they'd be kind of quiet because they are, voiceless, but that didn't really seem to be the case at all. I guess I like to write in big chunks. There are people who write essays that write one essay about one thing and one essay about another thing, and they sell it to very different magazines. And then once they've gotten quite a few of them together, they call up a publisher and try to get the collected essays published. I don't work that way. I like to think of a book with a bunch of essays in it that all sort of vibrate around a similar theme or frequency. And sort of one of the pleasures, hopefully, of reading the book is to see all the different places that it can go, all sort of holding on to that same center. So I enter in a project knowing that it's something that it's nimble enough that I can really focus on it for a long period of time. So I'm a little nervous now, honestly, because really the only two things that I love in this world are talking and animals. So I don't know, I'm open for suggestions for book number 3, you guys. I don't know where we're gonna go now. So, but when I was thinking about a big book-length project that I could really sort of focus on, I sort of I do these practice kind of recon missions, and I think of 16, 17, 30 different things that I could do underneath that umbrella. So that lets me know that it's a focus with enough sort of possibilities on the inside of it that I could spend 3, 4, 5 years of my life kind of working in it. And then the real pleasure for me, at least, as a writer, is once I've put that tent up and told myself that I have to work inside that format, finding all the different possibilities inside. That's the challenge, is I give myself a structure and then I have to stay creative inside of it. And I'm not sure I 100% answered your question. Yeah? Oh, sweet. Yeah. 1 for 1. Yes, sir, in the red hoodie.
So, your Bear essay is written in iams. I assume as some sort of call to Shakespeare, because Shakespeare's the one who, and the time period in general, right? So how are the other essays formally organized in relation to their context, their animals, their time period, things like that? Do you make those decisions with each essay?
That's a great question. Did everybody hear that question more or less? Yeah? All these young ears. I could barely hear. So I was talking to the group, the discussion group earlier about this. For me, the thing that I love to do the most is research like crazy person, and then let the research dictate the way that the essay goes. So nearly every essay in the book, formally or sonically, lexically, is in response to something that I figured out. So another example, I said a little bit about Mozart's Starling. Mozart we know he had this bird for at least 3 years. We really don't know very much about Mozart, surprisingly. But for 3 months, they were like, dude, you're losing a bunch of money. Please write down everything you buy. And he was like, okay. And he wrote down everything that he bought, and then he quit because he was like me. He can't, follow a schedule. So, in those 3 months, we know he bought a bird because it says, I bought a bird for 34 Kreutzer. And then there's this little line of music. And it's a piano concerto that he had just written, but it's just messed up enough to kind of not be musical anymore. And then at the very bottom, he says, that was gorgeous. So we know that we think that the bird sang that to him, like this messed up version of his own music. And he was like, yeah. And then, so there he is in the historical record. And then on the other side, we know he threw it a funeral when it died, and he wrote this incredible poem for it that's in his papers about how the bird's up there watching him, and he's lost this great friend and collaborator, but don't worry, bird, I'm still crushing it down here. It's a really, really cocky poem, honestly, Mozart. And it was this really elaborate funeral, and he wrote a dirge for it and stuff. So when I learned that, I was like, well, that's going in. Also, it's kind of a happy story. When you write a book about animals, there's not a lot of happy stories. Even Arabella ended up curled up in her vial in the end, So I knew I wanted to make the piece. Oh, and then so Mozart is kind of this star of sonata form, right? Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Stars in sonata form, right? And along with billions of other things that Mozart wrote. And then I learned that starlings also have a 4-part song structure. And then they riff in the middle of it. So they have their own sonata jazz form. So I knew that the piece had to have that kind of a structure. I knew it had to be in sonata form, even if nobody ever knows. For me, it would give me something to lean on while I was wading through all this research. And then I knew that it had to feel like classical music. It had to have, at least for me, this kind of run of lines that sort of follow each other and join in and join out, like a great Mozart opera. This kind of conversation piece. So that kind of drove me to do that. One other example that's real quick. The world's most famous cat poem. I mean, debatably, maybe one of you will write the world's most famous cat poem later. But right now, the world's most famous cat poem was written by this guy in an insane asylum in the late 18th century, in the 1700s. And they didn't find it till the 1930s. And recently we learned that it's not a straight through poem. There's actually a left side missing to the page that no one's ever seen. So we've all been loving this poem for nearly 100 years, and we haven't even seen the right side of it. So I was like, oh, great. Now I have to finish. So I finished the left side. I finished the left side of the thing. So yeah, the research and what I learned sort of dictates it. I could have answered that in a sentence, but instead I answered it in 25 minutes. So that's the way I roll. Yeah, anything else? Hi, Joey, hi, yay!
So you do a really nice parallel with the astronaut and the spider.
Uh-huh.
That to me sounded like a serendipitous writer moment where you didn't know going into the essay that parallel was going to do so much work for you in the essay. Can you talk a little bit about how that parallel developed?
Sure. Well, I mean, if you don't take anything else from me blathering into this very nice microphone, but just take this, and I think you probably agree with me, and I bet you do too. Nonfiction is magic. You'll have a hunch about something, and then you'll go research it, and you'll be able to find it. Like 8 times out of 10, the most perfectly aligned artifact or story or narrative or process will just show up next to you, and then you'll just set your whole essay afloat on it, right? So the hook for me to research that essay was just that the first North American female in space was a spider. I mean, it's just a great line. I imagine myself standing in front of a podium and saying that, and people being like, "I'll buy that book." Will you? And then so just very, I think very slowly. I think the first thing that really clued me in was when I saw the picture of Owen Garriott giving his spacewalk, and he had a cord coming out. It's like the old school Space Odyssey where there's this cord kind of coming out before, and it looked the same, So I spent one morning looking at YouTube clips of a cross spider spinning her web, and then another clip of these early 70s spacewalks, and there was the same image. And I was like, could this be? And then you sort of like with one eye covered, I start looking up all of the different things about NASA that might sort of coincide, like the webbed floor. You just start hunting it and it all shows up. And then I realized this is another sort of formal thing. The only thing that I really want, and then when I was researching, I noticed I was taking notes in 2 columns. Like I was taking notes about what the spider was doing, and then I was taking notes about the space thing. So it's like even my thought process when I was putting it together were asking for these parallels. And so then I knew I just needed to make an essay. It's hard to do when you're reading it out loud, but on the page, I knew I wanted to make an essay that goes like this. You know what I mean? So I just that was the only, so it was a little more hippy dippy than iambic pentameter, I know, but like I knew, so that was, so the parallels and then that desire, and then I just pushed myself until I was sort of satisfied. If I could do it again now, every time I read it, I see 6 or 7 things that I could do to make it a little floatier, but I wanted, and then it's the lifeline is the connection between the 2 parallels. Did that answer your question, Joey? Good, thank you. Hi.
Could you go into a little bit more depth on your research process? Because all of yours are so beautifully researched.
Oh, thank you.
At one point, stop.
So I connect it was about research process. I connect my research process. Please don't do this. This is not the way to research. This is not right. This is wrong. It's the equivalent of eating a chocolate cake and then just saying you're going to run a marathon later. I love research. I love Wikipedia wormholes. I love Wikipedia. Don't tell anybody. There's no Wikipedia in the book, but there was Wikipedia in the process. I love going to the library to get one book on pigeons and warfare and then just checking out the whole shelf and then just dumping it all over my office and sort of just leaping around and reading a word from Belle in Beauty and the Beast, in the opening scene, and she's just pulling all these books off the shelves. I'm like that, only I don't sing as well, And I have these really almost this big, big pieces of paper on the walls of my office. I call it my serial killer wall, and I just write down what I'm learning. I try to track the source material as best as I can, facts, quotes, places to go. And often, like I said, with the NASA thing, I'm researching wildly different topics at the same time. How a spider builds her web and the history of American space travel. Just no, and then I write them all down at once and just try to hold on to as many of these things as possible until something pops into my head that's either a structure or a first line or a shape or, and then I move to the keyboard. And so that's the chocolate cake, just this delicious, multifaceted, irresponsible, watching a movie and just writing these crazy notebooks full of things. And then the marathon is when I sell it to a magazine and they go, "What is this?" Or the book gets fact checked. So the fact checking in the end to make sure that all the material is effective is, it's like a triathlon or an Ironman or something. It's just an intense, and I really hate the chocolate cake of research that I had just done at that point. My favorite fact check story that I'll tell you, and then maybe we have to go. For the Mozart essay, I wanted to do this really deep analysis of the Starling's tweak of the thing. And I took I played the upright bass in high school, but that doesn't really give you a great musical education, quelle surprise. So I watched all these MOOCs, massive online courses, like Intro to Music Theory. And as best I could, I wrote this analysis of it. And I knew it was at least 30% just wrong. And so then a friend of mine had just met on one of those dating sites that's not very serious, not like OkCupid, but one of those ones where you're just kind of casually dating. I don't know what they're called. I haven't ever been on them, but she met a guy who taught music theory at a college near my house, and I was like, "Don't break up with him." I was like, "Take him out for coffee. Maybe you guys could go for a hike." And so that finally we could casually meet, and then I made him fact check my essay, and then she dumped him. But he's got a line in the book. He's got a thank you in the book, so hopefully that relationship worked out for him. So that was part of the marathon that I had to run, so my friends have to run the marathon for me too. But it checked out. Like the fact checker was like, "No, that's totally right." But when he looked at when he not the fact checker, when this poor jilted man looked at my thing, he was like, "Yeah, this is about 60% right." And then he helped me sort of fix everything. I feel like I really didn't make a case for research-based narrative in that response, but go to the library, cite your sources. Yeah, I think that's right. That's all the time we have. These were great questions. Thank you so much, and have a great day. Stay dry. Take care.